Hello everyone, Sucker here, and welcome back to the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel. And on today's episode, did you know that Mexico had tanks before the United States did? Yeah, this is going to sound kind of weird right off the bat because Mexico is not exactly a country that is very oftentimes associated with tank production of, well, any kind. What's more, as of recently, if you look at the army of Mexico, then they don't actually have any tanks at all. Which is just another thing that makes it all the more surprising that back in 1917, Mexico would join a very selected group of tank-producing nations with the TNCA Salinas. And in doing so, they beat the United States at making a tank first. But okay, how exactly does something like this happen? What is the story behind this tank? Well, as many stories with Mexico often do, this one starts with the Mexican Revolution. We have to start out this video by saying that the Mexican Revolution has got to be one of the most important events in the 20th century, particularly when it comes to Mexican history, as it completely changed the socio-political fabric of the entire society. This was big. For over 3 decades prior to this, Mexico had been ruled by something that was known as El Porfiriato. In other words, it was the presidency of General Porfirio Diaz. That is until he was forced to resign in 1911. But before all that went down, this whole thing started because he had fixed an election result in 1910, making him the winner, and the people were not going to have any of that and mobilized against him. Now, I will say this now, but the Mexican Revolution deserves its own video entirely. It really does. But we need to talk about it a little bit in a quick summary to explain the context that this tank arises in. If you wanted to describe the Mexican Revolution, then the short of it is that a number of groups that were led by different revolutionaries, which included people like Francisco Madero, Pascual Orozco, Pancho Villa, Emiliano Zapata, and many more, all participated in a long and very costly conflict against the government and against each other that over the course of it would cost over 1 million lives. This whole thing was very messy, and in the end the Constitutionalists would win in the year 1917, which is right around the time that the tank that we're talking about in this video was introduced, but the conflicts in Mexico would go on for many more years after still. So then what is with the tank? Well, one of the problems that Mexico had was that it had never really been a major arms producer. It was something that always had to depend on foreign imports for any kind of major military operation. And the constant warfare and situations that they were facing during the revolutionary period would only exacerbate the need for more weapons. So with this in mind, the pro-government group, the Constitutionalists, under the orders of General Venustiano Carranza, would go on to lead a project to build arms factories for home production starting around 1915. 2 of these by 1917, the Escuela Militar de Aviación, the Military Aviation School, and Talleres Nacionales de Construcción Aeronáutica, the TNCA, the National Aircraft Construction Factories. These were inaugurated in Mexico City. And the reason that we're talking about these 2 factories is that at some point between 1916 and 1917, you had Carranza's nephew, an aviator by the name of Major Alberto Salinas Carranza, who is attributed to have designed a tank which would go on to receive the name TNCA Salinas. TNCA being after the factory where it was built, and Salinas in honor of its designer, although the tank is more commonly known as the Tanque Salinas, Salinas's tank. Which brings us to having to talk about the tank itself. I don't really know what kind of words I would use to describe this thing because it definitely is rather interesting, and I love looking at early tank design because it can get really weird. I mean, if you're going to be looking at the outside of this tank, then the closest thing that it probably resembles is going to be the early British rhomboid tanks, the ones such as the Mark I, which were used during the Great War. These were the things that had tracks that would run down each side surrounding a hull and would cover the entire length of the machine. Then on each side, they would have sponsons that would carry the secondary armaments that would consist of machine guns, but the main armament itself was actually located at the center of the frontal hull, much like the design of the French Saint-Chamond tank. And then at the top of the tank, there was a large box-like cabin, something that was similar to the Mark V and other later rhomboid tanks that was meant for the driver and the commander. I'm really not kidding when I say this, but the whole thing looks like someone took a Mark I tank and then stuck a shed just right on top of it. If the design looks odd and you think that it wouldn't be able to provide a lot of protection, then you are probably right in that scenario. I mean, truthfully, we don't exactly know how great the protection of this vehicle was, as there really is no written record of its armor. We can really only estimate, based off its similarities to early British models, that it was probably around 7 meters long, maybe weighed around 20 tons, and that it had perhaps anywhere between 6 to 12 millimeters of armor. Which, yeah, that is going to sound pretty light, but the funny thing is that even that light armor is going to do absolutely nothing to protect the crewmen who are trying to get in and out of the vehicle in the first place. If you go and look at a photo of the tank, you can see that in front of the sponsons, there were doors for crews to access on either side, which in combat, that would have been a serious issue. Now you may wonder why, and the reason is because the machine guns that were on the sponsons would not have been able to fire forward because the door opening would have ended up blocking the machine gun in the first place. And secondly, because of the way the door would open, crew members would then be vulnerable when they were exiting the tank in the middle of combat because the door was facing forward. So you would be blocking your own machine gun, and then you would be getting out of it directly in the enemy line of fire. Definitely not a good situation. But speaking of the crew, inside of the tank, you would have had a crew of around 6 to 8 people. A commander, a driver, perhaps 2 to 3 crew members to operate the main gun in the front, and then you would have needed to have one person for either side to operate each one of the machine guns that was on the sponsons. There was also possibly room for an engineer, but we don't really know. And speaking of more stuff that we don't know, we also don't know what engine was supposed to go in this thing in the first place. We can probably assume based off size that this would have used an engine of around 90 to 100 horsepower, but TNCA, the company that made the tank in the first place, was an aircraft company that made aircraft parts. As a result, this thing could have easily used some kind of aircraft engine, we just really don't know. We do definitely know what gun went in it, and if you're wondering about my phrasing there, no, I'm serious. Not a gun that was attached to it, but rather a gun that went in it. If you look at the front of the tank, the front hull had a large square cut into it which would allow the gun to fire from the inside. The gun being a Hotchkiss 5-barreled rotating cannon. Again, this is a gun that was not fitted to the hull, but rather it was mounted internally inside of the tank and would shoot outwards. The only actual protection that this gun had was the original shield that went on the Hotchkiss itself, which I have pictured here. And this, mind you, is a very odd weapon for a tank to have. Don't get me wrong, the whole thing was accurate, it did have a pretty quick reload time, but it did have a series of drawbacks, including the fact that this did not have a very long range, and it was exceptionally heavy. I mean, we're talking about a gun that was primarily going to be used on warships or on coastal defense batteries, not on mobile artillery platforms. Each round that the gun fired weighed around 1.1 kilograms and would fire at a muzzle velocity of 455 meters per second. When you fired a solid AP shot from this gun, it could perforate 45 millimeters of steel at close ranges, which, if you consider the fact that tanks at this time were anywhere between, 6 to 12 millimeters, that's gonna wreck anything that it goes up against, which would have probably made it excellent against close-range targets in an urban environment. But, of course, the funny thing about this tank was that there really was no targets for this tank to go up against in the first place. Don't get me wrong, this is a very fun and fascinating tank to look at, but we really don't know what the idea was behind it. We don't know why anyone needed this tank in the first place. By 1917, the Civil War was winding down. It was more of a consolidation of power by the new president, Venustiano Carranza. At that point, it was all but complete. Also, the primary purpose of tanks in warfare when they were first introduced was to be able to get across trenches. It was the thing to break the stalemate in trench warfare. But Mexico, during its revolution, that was not something that devolved into trench warfare. In the plains and deserts of the center and the north, horses and more mounted mobile warfare was still very important. While if you were looking at the jungles in the south, then guerrilla warfare was something that worked better. Tank technology at this time simply wasn't good enough to actually fit either one of these roles. And if you were trying to transport a tank back and forth between the different theaters of war, that is just not something that would have worked. There really seemed to be no immediate need for this tank in the first place. Of course, I say that, but there are reasons why someone would want a tank. Tanks were, after all, a very new idea, and any state around the world did not want to be left behind when adopting a new technology. Mexico would have probably been in the same boat as any other nation and really wanted to push itself into the modern age, even if what they were doing was producing a tank that didn't actually do anything. And on that note, about not doing anything, that's really it. We don't actually know if this tank was ever used in combat. There's no sources that tell us whether or not it was. Nothing that can be confirmed. We don't know if any others were produced because there is, quite frankly, no record of them. The company that produced the tank in the first place, TNCA, was eventually bought by Canadian Car and Foundry. But before then, the company was really not in a good position. It was in a heavy decline due to the fact that the government wasn't investing any resources into it, and simultaneously, any domestic purchasers were primarily interested in foreign aircraft rather than any locally made ones. Salinas' tank would end its operational life at some point in the 1930s. Here, its gun was removed and it was converted into a type of guardhouse or checkpoint outside the airbase at Balbuena near Mexico City. Ironically, not too far from where the tank was originally built. Past that, we don't really know what happened to the tank. Mexico would not build any more of them, and they wouldn't have any other tanks until they would purchase some in the late 1930s from the United States. I will say this here in the end. The TNCA Salinas was never a tank that was going to absolutely change the world and the history of warfare and tanks as we know it. That's simply not the case. But it is still a fascinating tank to look at and study, and it's really important in the grand scheme of things historically because this was the first tank that was produced by a nation outside of Europe. Unfortunately, besides that, and the other details that I shared with you earlier in this video, there really isn't any more information about this tank, which is honestly kind of sad because I would have loved if we could have gotten more information on it. It truly is something that is fascinating. Thank you to the commenter that suggested this video. I ask that you like, comment, subscribe, do anything you can to help this video in the algorithm. Also, make sure everyone to buy my coffee, join in on Patreon, do anything you possibly can to help support this video in the algorithm and support me. You will love my coffee and everything if you try it. It is special for the history of everything. In fact, from that note, I should probably do an episode on Lewis and Clark because coffee's called Lewis and Dark. It's good. Anyway, I will leave you all with that. Thank you everyone for watching. I hope you have a good rest of your day, and goodbye, guys.